Hello, I'm Jeff Folks, and I'm standing in front of the George Line Farm on Smoketown Road, just north of Antietam Battlefield. It's where the asphalt of Smoketown Road ends and the gravel picks up. George Line was my fifth great-grandfather. Today is September 16th, 2023, and I'm here today to tell you a story about what happened here on this farm on September 16th, 1862. 161 years ago today. According to my family history, in August of 1760, a gentleman named Martin Lyon, spelled Lyon, left Lancaster, Pennsylvania and moved to Boonesboro, where he purchased a 208-acre farm he named Fellfoot from Joseph Chaplin, who would later become the founder of Sharpsburg. Martin's youngest son was George Line, who inherited this farmstead. He changed his last name to the current spelling of Line, L-I-N-E. The Line farmhouse was a two-story log house, which measured about 26 feet by 22 feet, and the logs were painted white. After the Battle of Antietam, the house entered the Civil War history books, forever known as the White House Hospital. Now, a few days ago, on the 14th of September, the Battle of South Mountain raged on that mountain range in the distance there. It was a Sunday morning, and cannon fire could clearly be heard in the church services in Sharpsburg. The citizens were in a panic, not knowing what to expect. Skirmishes began all around Sharpsburg after the battle as Lee retreated across the Potomac into Virginia. Citizens were taking refuge wherever they can find it, in cellars and even in caves, namely two of them along the Potomac River just west of here, the Snyder's Landing Cave and the Killiansburg Caves. According to family history from my second cousins, the family fled to the caves, taking 3 horses with them and all the provisions they could carry. Moving forward to today, it's September 16th, 1862. I do not know the time of day, but the family farmhouse was suddenly taken over by the Union Army, and they began to set up a makeshift hospital inside the farmhouse. Now, the White House Hospital was also known as Dr. King's Hospital. And there's also some reports where Dr. Donnelly and 4 assistants served at this hospital, treating 1,052 soldiers, at least 100 of them Confederates. The Union Army instructed the family to move all the contents into the other room, and that they did. Now, beyond the Line farmhouse behind me, which you can just barely make out in the trees back there in the distance by that pickup truck, on the other side of it is the Huffman farm. Now, between 11 o'clock tonight and the early hours of tomorrow, the Line and Huffman farms became the bivouac of the Union Army 12th Corps under the command of General Joseph Mansfield. Over 12,000 soldiers were now spread between those two farms. It has been written that General Mansfield bedded down on the Line farm on the west side of a fence, which ran south from the garden to the woods, lying on grass with a blanket over him, sort of like a makeshift lean-to. Rain fell into the night, and by 2 a.m., the 12th Corps was all together on both farms. George Line must have been busy the last couple days spreading manure on his field. It was written that the men of the brigade that was halted on the George Line farm wondered what ill fate had directed them to be bivouacked on a freshly manured field. At daybreak tomorrow, the bloodiest single-day battle in the history of the United States began. It started with Major General Joseph Fighting Joe Hooker, who began his advance from the north along the Sharpsburg Pike, with the 1st Corps smashing into the Confederate left flank near the Dunkard Church. The Confederates engaged in a counterattack, and the Battle of the Cornfield began. The Battle of the Cornfield was one of the nastiest parts of the Battle of Antietam. The cannon fire was immense. It was actually referred to as artillery hell. And the musket shots were constant. General Mansfield followed immediately behind with the 12th Corps. Around 7 a.m., General Mansfield was deploying his troops to the area of the West Woods and the infamous cornfield. He rode back to gather more troops and returned to the area of the West Woods around 7:30 a.m. and noticed his men were firing into the woods. Spurring his horse, he began yelling and waving his hat to the men to stop firing, thinking they were firing on Hooker's men in the West Woods, until they convinced him that they were indeed Confederate soldiers. At that moment, Mansfield was struck in the chest by a bullet and his horse was wounded also. 5 soldiers with the 125th Pennsylvania helped the general from his mount, and using their muskets and blankets, made a makeshift chair and carried the general to a nearby tree out of harm's way to wait for an ambulance. During this journey, Mansfield repeated several times, "Oh my God, am I to die thus? And oh my poor family." Dr. Patrick Henry Flood, a surgeon with the 107th New York Regiment, appears to be the first to examine his wound. Following that, Mansfield was later picked up and taken to the line farm. The doctor treated his wounds, which penetrated just below his nipple and out the back of his shoulder blade. General Mansfield died of his wounds in an upper room of the line home. The death toll at this house was 156 soldiers, 101 Union, 55 Confederates. Just over 1,000 soldiers were treated at the line farm that day. The family history also claims that Elizabeth Lyon gave birth during the battle, but we do not know if this was in the Lyon house or in the caves or at another farm. One day I hope to find some account of this. When the Lyons returned home, everything of value was gone. Following the battle, citizens from the local and surrounding area came to the aftermath to lend a helping hand with the wounded and the dying. In the book Too Afraid to Cry by Kathleen Ernest, she provides the most unbelievable detail and account on what happened at this farm that day. I'd like to read you a couple paragraphs from that book. Many civilians pushed aside their own shock and willingly helped the overwhelming needs of the wounded, who at any of the field hospitals were already waiting in rows in the yard, packed so closely together that there was scarcely room to pass between them. By morning on September 18th, women were already binding the wounds, holding hands, making tea, distributing whatever provisions they could provide. Dying men, terrified of being lost to the unknown, begged the women to write down their names. In Funkstown, Angela Davis and her husband quickly packed some provisions and journeyed to the battlefield. As we stepped out of our carriage, a ghastly, gruesome sight met our gaze. She wrote later, the Davises made their way to one of the hospitals. Mr. Lyon's house was used by the surgeons for amputating purposes and dressing wounds, and there were 1 or 2 tables in the yard being used for the same purpose, and a pile of hands, arms, and legs lying on the ground. A horrible and sickening scene to behold, such as I never wish to see again. I staggered from the carriage, but exercising all of my willpower, kept from fainting. One of the wounded men, who seemed to be dying, looked up at me and exclaimed, "Oh, Thurza, is that you?" The surgeon near nodded for me to say yes. As I knelt down by his side and took his cold, clammy hand in mine, he again said excitedly, "Oh, Thurza, is that you? I'm so glad you have come. I knew you would. I knew you would." And in a few moments, his spirit quietly and sweetly passed away. I have often wished I could meet this Thurza and tell her that her husband supposed she was with him in his dying hour. Soon after, a mortally wounded man was carried in on a stretcher, lying in a pool of blood dripping from every side. The scene was too much for Angela, and as she fainted, there was a scurry at the pump, which had been locked to prevent precious water from being wasted. Revived, she moved on to comfort another wounded soldier. It's hard to imagine the scenes at this farm on that day. The death, destruction, men dying, and they had to be buried immediately. And they were buried in very shallow graves all over the farm and all over the landscape of Antietam battlefield. It's no wonder it was reported that the lines moved about the area for a few years. All of their crops were destroyed, about 200 chickens gone, 3 hogs, and their entire livelihood. An unknown number of bodies were buried in temporary shallow graves on the farm. One account from a Facebook contact I made shows that his ancestor, Sergeant Seaborn Sutton of Company H, 6th Georgia, died at the farmhouse. He was struck down in Miller's cornfield and captured and taken to the line farm where he died. He was buried in their orchard. He also has an account of another soldier who was in the 6th Georgia, and he died here also. Later, the bodies would be buried in the Confederate Memorial section of Roseville Cemetery in Hagerstown. The White House Hospital was evacuated as quickly as space and tents became available elsewhere. I can't imagine what the Lyon family came back to that day, or even if they came back that day. They could have come back the second day. We don't know. At some point after the battle, it could have been a year or 2 years, we don't know, but the house was removed from this site. The logs were marked with Roman numerals, taken apart log by log, and transported to a property along the Keedysville Road. The log house is now hidden behind a brick home. It still exists. It's just no longer here. George Lyon built a new home on the farm afterwards. Now, we don't know if it's the brick farm that's here right now or if it was another log home. My great-grandparents were Morris and Edith Paulsgrove. My great-grandmother passed away in my junior year of high school, and my great-grandfather in my senior year of high school. To us kids, they were Granny and Pappy. I never had a chance or took the effort to sit down with my great-grandparents and talk about any family history. I knew Edith's maiden name was Lyon, but never knew anything of it. I started working on my family tree in 1993. Tucked inside my great-grandparents' large Bible were numerous papers with family names and relations on them. One day I was looking at a map of the battlefield at the Antietam Battlefield Visitor Center and noticed the name Lyon marking a farm that existed during the battle. I thought to myself, this isn't some common last name. There has to be a connection to my great-grandmother's side of the family. A few days later, I connected the dots and found the Lyon farm here on Smoketown Road. I want to thank Catherine Ernest for her book, Too Afraid to Cry, John Banks for the information I found on his blog referring to this George Lyon farm, and Stephen Cowley for his book, When Hell Came to Sharpsburg. Some of the most fantastic information I could have ever learned about George Lyon and what he did after the war. And finally, the Reverend John Schilt, where I first learned of George Lyon in the book Drums Along the Antietam. Because of my constant research building my family tree, I was able to uncover part of American history that would have been lost to the ages and to our family. This story I just shared with you is my quest to keep the nation's history alive for future generations. It all started with making my family tree. Make a family tree with your kids or your grandkids. You just might find something you never expected, like I did. If you've ever seen the memorial luminaries on the battlefield in December, I encourage you to do so. One of the luminaries glows for General Mansfield, who died here, and one glows in our family's heart for the Lyon family. Thank you.